The winner of Trans Theory will receive a sickening supply of makeup from NYX Cosmetics.
And a cash prize of $100,000. Hi, I'm Yarrow.
Hi, I'm Ash.
And today our topic for the podcast is lateral violence, intra-community violence from one trans person to another.
Yeah, so what is lateral violence? So Jane Middleton Moss in 1999 coined the term lateral violence, and this term, it describes the internalization. So internalization is when you believe something that is oppressive. So it's the internalization of oppression that leaves us in a state of shame. And the shame is a sense of never being good enough. And this is quoting an article from Susie Goodleaf and Wanda Gabriel. And the article is The Front Line of Revitalization Influences Impacting Aboriginal Helpers. So we use, lateral violence is not only for trans people, it's happening in a lot of oppressed communities too. And lateral violence, how would you say it manifests itself, Yarrow, in our community?
Well, I think the unfortunate thing is that a lot of trans people are looking for a safe space, and they go to trans communities online a lot of the time or in person. And a lot of trans people have experienced a lot of trauma and have a lot of big emotions jumping inside of them, a lot of emotional instability, emotional dysregulation, a lot of
shame. Let's say it. Shame.
Yeah, a lot of shame, a lot of anxiety, depression, like just very, a lot of things that are limiting their capacity to like be present and kind and empathetic and patient. And so you often see, unfortunately, in these same spaces that are supposed to be like the safe places for trans people to go, that's often where we end up getting really badly hurt by other trans people who, are taking out all their shit on us.
I want to make something, very clear for the listeners here. So lateral violence is a concept that is introduced to not individualize violence too. As in, this concept is relating to violence in a way that is systemic. That means it comes from systems of oppression. That means that trans people are doing that to other trans people, not because they wouldn't do that in a state that they wouldn't be oppressed. They do that because cisgender people give them a hard time, make them feel shame, and in order to make themselves feel better, to give themselves a sense of worth, sometimes, and even when like someone is trying to help them, they're not gonna attack other cis people. They're going to attack what they feel is reachable, what is something in their scope in terms of power relations, right? Mm. And so they're going to try. Sometimes it can be something like to raise their sense of self-esteem. They're going to put down some other trans person by making them feel shame and making them look worse than they actually do, even when they have said something that can be very little.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like who can you hurt? It's who you have power over. And who do you have power over? It's often the people who are the most vulnerable. So rather than attacking the targets that are the most powerful and that do the most harm, we attack the people who are, the weakest, the most hurt, the most wounded, and the most susceptible to being hurt more, and the most at risk for all kinds of like mental health problems and other bad outcomes.
Yeah. And I observe a lot in, the trans community that lateral violence, like we were talking on the last episode, is happening a lot when we talk about injustices, not even related to our own sometimes. But oftentimes it is about oppression, and oftentimes it is about like someone doing something that is morally in the group considered like unethical or not moral, like immoral. And it might be like just it's just a shortcoming. It's just like a little mistake sometimes, and it takes like disproportionate, it's just disproportionate sometimes. And I would say almost at all times, it's very disproportionate to what it could actually be. And so lateral violence is a good explanation of the high levels of infighting in our own communities. So in order to actually overcome our oppressions, instead of focusing on the fact that, we're in the same boat, we're suffering together on the basis of the same oppression, we fight other people, but we're also losing our energy at the same time. And this lateral violence, I think, is one of the reasons why it's so hard to liberate our own selves. So what I mean by that is, when we're so busy fighting inside our own groups, we don't spend that same amount of energy fighting the oppressions that is keeping us in that situation and that is actually causing the lateral violence. And it's a very vicious circle.
So you're bringing up like one common issue is like very strict moral policing, where there's sort of a disproportionate response to like the infraction. It's almost like if someone says something quote unquote problematic, it's almost like rather than there being a scale of how problematic it is from 1 to 10 and a scale of severity of response from 1 to 10, it's like everything is treated as a 10 in badness, and the response is like a 10 in harshness, like most of the time or all of the time.
Yeah.
Also, the response is more often than not, in my experience and what I've seen around me, is rather than like really a kind, warm attempt to like educate or correct someone, it's like almost always like very harsh and like very very angry and hostile and like casting a lot of blame.
Yeah. So, we talk about the moral aspect, or little shortcomings that we have sometimes, little mistakes we do. But, in communities, especially, for example, over Facebook or, any, caring community for trans, gender diverse, and non-binary people, well, there are people in those communities that pay the high price for the high price high cost for empathizing with the pain of others, and that can also trigger lateral violence.
What do you mean by that?
So when someone's in pain, and that happens a lot with helpers. So there could be a social worker, for example, me. Well, I'm not a social worker. I'm not allowed to say that yet, but I'll be it in a month. But if you want to help someone, or even in the Facebook community, if you are trying to empathize with them, sometimes they're going to come back at you and they're going to be like, I don't want your pity. You're trying to do too much for me. It's like what we talked about is like the internalization of oppression, right? It's like sometimes they even internalize that they should be this way, and that you trying to help them is like a trigger, and it triggers lateral violence. And a related topic on that is that for a lot of helpers, it really triggers them sometimes, because, you know, you're like, I'm trying my best. And I had an example that happened to me quite recently where I had someone and I did the world to help them, to try to empower them. Sometimes I would get a message over mail a week later that would be sometimes full of insults or very, not fun to read at all. And so that, for the people who in our communities care a lot, it can create, I don't know if you're familiar with a vicarious trauma. It's kind of like a compassion exhaustion. And it actually like is a trauma because it makes you think that there's nothing to do. You internalize your turn, that it's helpless. And it actually changes the way your brain is wiring. In that way, it's a trauma. And so it's kind of very hard to get out of that dynamic where even if you're trying to help someone who's very much like has like internalized transphobia, for example, well, it might be a cul-de-sac sometimes.
Yeah, so it's like this again is like an example of how the mental health burden that trans people have, the burden of internalized transphobia, of internalized shame, can often get taken out on each other, like other people in our own community. Yeah, and how these spaces that are supposed to be safe can often be where we end up getting hurt over and over, which really sucks because, often for trans people, like for myself, there was definitely a time where I found it very hard to trust anyone. And for a time I felt like really in a lonely and scary place because I couldn't trust cis people because there was just systemic transphobia and it was so hard to get away from that. But then around trans people, I just kept getting hurt over and over again with like a lot of these same patterns happening over and over, where it seemed like all the trans people I was interacting with were so on edge that like I was walking on eggshells around them, and like no matter what I did, sooner or later something would happen and they would snap and they would really hurt me and start to see me as the enemy and like stop talking to me or like work to exclude me or so it can be very I read an essay, I forget the author's name, but the title is Hot Allostatic Load. It's written by a trans feminine person who wrote about her experiences of lateral violence in queer communities and feminist communities. Some of it lateral violence, some of it from cis people. Yeah, and I really relate. That's a great essay that I recommend the listeners go read, because it really, for me, expressed the feeling of desperation and helplessness that you can feel when you feel like the broader world is not safe for people like you.
Exactly.
And then even your own community of people like you is not safe for you either.
Exactly. So let's talk about these communities, right? My experience is mostly on Facebook. As some of the listeners might know, I was the moderator and the administrator of a trans Facebook support group, which ended up imploding because I was just absolutely unsafe. I actually decided to rip out the group, and I actually think that was a great decision. But let's let's talk about the dynamic within. And so those there's a point where you come out, and these groups are so useful. You come out, you don't know anything. You don't know anything. There's no other people like you that you know in real life, like in person sometimes. That's the case for a lot of trans people, and especially trans youth who come out. And there comes a time where you learn a lot and you like these spaces, and then whoop, for example, I posted at some point on another group that I had a bad experience at a medical clinic. I bet you remember pretty well. So I had a very bad experience at a medical clinic that is supposed to be trans affirmative, and that was advertising itself, or other trans people were advertising it, that clinic as trans affirmative. But I was just, writing this open letter to trans people and saying, like, you might want to reconsider just, referring other trans, especially non-binary people there. Because the experiences I've had were that they were not trans affirmative. They were pretty much gatekeepers, and it was a whole shenanigan. It was a whole, very hard moment in my life. When I got out of there twice, I had 2 doctors there. Every time I got out of there, I was in a suicidal crisis. And I posted that letter saying that it was awful. And it was the most aggravating medical experience I've ever had in my entire life. I was told I was not trans. Quote unquote, the person said, I only help trans people.
Implying that you're not trans.
Exactly.
Like, I can't help you because I only help trans people.
That's exactly what he said. The first one, so that was the second one. The first one said that before proceeding, they wanted my mental health records. And to me, that triggered so much shame. And I was like, what does my mental health have to do with that? Like, my mental health is affected right now because I'm not having HRT, like hormone replacement therapy. And so I posted that. So that was a little vulnerable moment for y'all. The moment I posted that, I had at least 5 people saying, like, very rude things to me, saying that I am campaigning to like destroy the reputation of this clinic. And some were offended because they got help from there. And I was like, I was not commenting on your experience there. And I even said that at the end I wrote that at the end of the letter, and I was like, this is my experience. This has nothing to do with yours. And it's okay if you had a different one. But people, regardless, I feel like they didn't even read that and were like going off on me. And, just, it was exhausting. And some were like saying, some were like attacking me, like rudely, just almost or even insulting me, like saying I'm probably stupid because that is impossible.
Oh my God.
Yeah, that was awful. And some of those things were actually not in like some comments were actually taken down because they were outright like not good for Facebook's policy. But some of the comments I had in private messaging too. And it was the most painful experience of my life. I thought I got a lot of support too, but I wasn't expecting at all. I was just, I just came out to myself about like a year ago, and I was like in a crisis, and let's say it, I was in a mental health crisis. I was not doing good. I was like suicidal, like every day for almost 8 months. It was awful. And so that was a very adverse moment. And this is a good example of lateral violence. You're trying to get help. You're trying to get validation. You're trying to just get people's empathy. And what you get is violence and abuse and mean things about you. And they get personal, very personal.
Yeah. Yeah. That reaction when people say, well, I didn't experience this, so you couldn't have. And you're saying you experienced this, but you couldn't have, so there must be something wrong with your perception. Like you must be stupid, you must be delusional, or you must, or maybe you're lying and you have a bad motive. You're trying to ruin the reputation of these doctors because, why else would someone make this stuff up, which I know can't possibly be true because it didn't happen to me, so it couldn't have happened to you.
Yeah, and a lot of them, there's a special dynamic there's a very special dynamic in the trans community. As we know, there are different gender modalities, as in like cisgender is a gender modality, transgender is a gender modality, and woman is, a gender identity, and trans is, the modality of it. So we'll maybe touch on that later to another episode. But basically, there's a lot of different trans people in the community, as there are, non-binary people. Yeah. And there are binary trans people.
Yeah, so binary is a gender modality and non-binary is a gender modality, right?
Binary is not a gender modality.
But like trans-binary is a gender modality, and then trans non-binary is a gender modality?
I don't want to like really put myself on that ground now. I don't.
Okay. But that's sort of what you're getting at, like that there's a difference between the experience of binary trans people and non-binary trans people.
Exactly. So there are different experiences, and a lot of the people commenting that this can be true were either trans men and trans women, but so, binary trans. Yeah, and a lot of there were people who came, to help me and say, like people maybe you want to reconsider your argument because your experience is obviously going to be different.
Yeah.
Ash is actually non-binary, and non-binary people experience a you know, some other kind of oppression within the transgender oppression, right?
Like, so when that doctor said, like, you're not trans, like, I assume that was because he didn't see non-binary people as being, like, legitimately trans, right?
I would say yes and no, as in my expectation was, I think we talked about that in the first episode, as in my first expectation was I want estradiol, I want estrogen, I really, really need it. You know, I really want it to be accurate as, you know, I'm like that. I mean, I don't know if it's because I'm autistic, but I can't, when I try to, you know, tell my experience, I tell it truthfully. I don't try to hide things. I'm a very open book about it. And I really wanted to get, I thought that, you know, being truthful would be a reward. I thought that, you know,
with the doctor.
Yeah, exactly.
So why do you think, like, what did he hear that he didn't want to hear?
He didn't want to hear that I didn't want a breast, basically breasts. Yeah. And that, like, breast would make me feel dysphoric, gender dysphoric, as in, like, I would experience gender dysphoria if I had them. But good news, I had a mastectomy.
Right, so he had such a limited understanding of non-binary people that he didn't understand that someone could be trans and want hormones as part of a medical transition, but not want to develop breasts as part of that transition.
Exactly.
He was like, if you're trans and you're taking estrogen, you gotta want titties, or else you're not trans. Like, that's how narrow his idea was.
Exactly. And I think it's because even though he understood what non-binary meant, his expectations for non-binary people were still very binary, very dualistic. As in, no matter what, you gotta accept what comes with the medication. And it's like, even that, I was explaining to a lot of trans people in the comments, and it was just, no explanation was good enough. It was never, ever good enough.
And I wonder what stories they were making up in their heads. Like, what was the story they were telling themselves that made this post so threatening for them? Like, they had the image of these doctors as
saviors,
as like great people who like really helped them and they liked them a lot, and it was upsetting to hear that the doctors had hurt somebody, hurt someone trans so badly and in such a unjust way. Maybe that was what felt threatening to them, or like, who knows? But like, yeah, I there must have been something that felt to them, for them to like lash out this way in such a extreme manner. There must have been something, like, what they heard was
threatening.
Yeah, there must have been something threatening about what you said.
Yeah, and it's not necessarily objective, because objectively I wasn't threatening anyone. In fact, all I wanted was to get some validation as a baby trans person.
Yeah, and it's victim blaming. It's like,
yeah, it felt very like that, as in, you know, I am the one experiencing a hardship right now. Would you mind just stopping your accusations? And listen to what I needed in this. And what you said to me was very compelling, as in, it's interesting to frame it as what was their need, what was the story going on in their head. And truthfully, I can never know, but my hunch is really that, you know, they see these doctors as saviors, as there are so few of them in Quebec. Like in Montreal, there's just so few. But compared to like the amount of doctors that we have if we compare in percentage. But imagine like the amount of trans affirmative doctors in Quebec and like in the province of Quebec in general. There are so few of them, right? But it's like we idolize them. Mm-hmm. We make them our idols, and they're like they're our saviors. And wow, this trans person is like coming for them. Like, are they gonna stop doing it? But I wasn't coming for them. I was telling my experience, and I feel that what they were hearing was that I was attacking the clinic. Mm-hmm. When in fact I was trying to open a discussion on what it means to be trans affirmative and what it means to actually be a gatekeeper. Mm-hmm. And so for those who don't know what a gatekeeper is, the gatekeeping in the community is restraining or refusing trans people hormones just because with your cisgender expectations, the trans or non-binary person doesn't meet those criteria. And those are very subjective and very cisnormative. I would say Ashley would say that...
Who?
Florence Ashley would say that gatekeeping hormone therapy is destructive and dehumanizing.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree. And so I just wanted to bring up as our last topic, our last subtopic under the topic of lateral violence. Is there anything you can think of for community leaders, either formal or informal leaders, or people in trans communities, people who are creating them or maintaining them, moderating them? What suggestions can we give people about what to do about lateral violence, how to prevent it, how to address it when it happens? Like do we have any ideas about, solutions for lateral violence?
As a student in social work, you're not going to be surprised to hear me say this is a systemic issue, hence it needs a systemic response. To me, it means that an oppression is also like the person is not being recognized, so there's no recognition of the identity and what it means to be trans socially with like the government and whatever, like they don't really recognize us. And the second is that there is no redistribution of wealth to answer those needs being recognized. And so to me, it's a matter of a community, not a personal responsibility. It's a matter of we need to really try to breathe, trying to find solutions to just be in the moment and understand. We need to understand collectively that we're not against each other in this. We're all in this together. And then if we want to, overcome our situation, we need to organize. We need to let the government know our needs and know that we need to be recognized and ask for money so that trans people's mental health can actually be addressed. Because right now, and I'm saying this, but just a few days ago, there was a trans child who is 10 years old who took their own life. And that child was a non-binary person at 10 years old. And this really shows this situation because it was not in the media at all. It was on social media, but I watch the news quite frequently on TV, and that specific news was not on there. We are flying under the radar only because we are trans. And it needs to be addressed. And if trans people's mental health goes better, well, then we can assume that in our communities that we are trying to help each other, it's going to get better. It's going to get better exponentially. because we are, when we come out, almost our, if we don't have a supporting family, we're our own support. And we need to take what we need. And we need to let it be known that it's an issue.
Well, I would say that to anyone who's like trying to organize a community out there for trans people, I would say a big step would just be for more trans people participating in these communities to recognize lateral violence as a big problem that affects, I think, every trans community I've had experience with. And really, the first step to addressing a problem is just acknowledging it. And then I think in terms of guidelines and social norms for these groups and communities about lateral violence, I think there's a lot of things that you could do. For example, educating about nonviolent communication and encouraging people to use that. Even when someone is lashing out, if a third party, someone who's not the one lashing out or the person receiving that, if they could take that person aside and or like message them privately or whatever it is and say, like, you seem really upset about this. Like, is there something you want to talk about? Is there something I can help with? And sort of like treating them, like opening up with care and concern and empathy, rather than not necessarily continuing the cycle by like lashing out at them
or banning them immediately.
And you could take down their comment, if you're a moderator or like whatever the situation is. But
I think it's preferable also if you tell them beforehand that you take down their comment, that you will do it, and it's not to like, say that they're a bad person or whatever.
Yeah. So because like we know a lot of this is pain that's manifesting in an inappropriate and unjust way, an unfair way towards other people. And so understanding that like pain is at the root of this, like if we can have make a habit out of showing care and concern. And there's lots of, I definitely think that the norms of a lot of communities could be, if they understood lateral violence was a problem and they understood more about healthy communication and emotional regulation and how to talk to someone who's experiencing big feelings, then we could have communities with less harm in them.
Yeah, I would suggest also that what you're saying is a matter of resources too. What is hard too, and we need to recognize it, is that trans people are also the trans community is a community with few resources too, right? And especially those who hold these groups are oftentimes, trying to work to get and it's a lot of work. And what would be great as a suggestion is that we try to keep our groups with not too many people, or like have someone at the top that is, someone with like training, I would say, or like who has a very like good ability to have empathy for people, and it all comes down to not rejecting the people that are doing this violence, but also like trying to like, be present with their pain and suffering, like you were suggesting. But it's an ideal. It's very hard to do. And we, as an ex-moderator myself, I understand how hard that was.
Yeah.
And I am not right now in these communities anymore as much as I used to. And I would suggest to people, these communities are here for you, especially when you come out, especially when you have a lot of things going on. It's totally okay to use them. But I also suggest that people connect in real life.
Yes.
Go connect
yes.
in real life.
Yes, that's so important.
Go connect and make your own little family.
Yes.
Like Yarrow is mine.
Yeah.
And I think it's the most wonderful thing you're ever going to do if you find that little community. You're going to grow so much more with them than you're ever going to grow if you stay years in these communities without ever getting in touch with a trans person in real life.
Yeah. That's the tea.
Yeah, totally.
And so I guess these communities need to find trans therapists and social workers to lead them and pay them for their time. Fundraisers to, make sure they're compensated. That's number one, meet people in real life. Find your found family, your chosen family.
Yeah.
Find your chosen family and then hire therapists to run your Facebook groups.
Well, that's a matter of resources, but I will also suggest to people that sometimes it can be very beneficial to go and seek for community resources, and sometimes like they have therapists. Like I know at the Center for Lesbian Solidarity, Le Centre de Solidarité Lesbienne, where
In Montreal.
I work at in Montreal, we can do, for example, like video conferencing therapy or counseling for people. And so with that being more available since the pandemic, I think reaching out to these community organizations, and I know that in regions it might be hard and in other locations too, but sometimes you have like free services, sometimes like at to just name a few, like Réseau Santé, which is for men who have sex with men who include also non-binary people and trans people. Well, they have sessions, for example.
Yeah, and for people not in Quebec, I know there's a site. This is not trans specific, but there's a site called Open Path Collective. I think it's openpathcollective.org, but just Google Open Path Collective, and it's not free, but it's a way to find affordable therapy. I think in many different countries. So
yeah, there are many also sliding scales trans therapists that I know of. Sometimes they're gonna offer, like I'm probably gonna do this too. They're probably gonna offer a pay what you can price, and
yeah, there's some amazing therapists who will do that, and often offer free services to certain people.
Yeah, look these services on Google. Therapy, I think for anyone is therapy or counseling for anyone is so beneficial, especially knowing that trans people have a lot of trauma, especially like developmental trauma or just PTSD sometimes, unsupporting family. Yeah. So that can be a very good solution to. So those are more individual solutions to, lateral violence. But obviously the goal is to get our needs recognized and addressed by our governments. Yeah.
And let's take care of each other. Let's heal. Let's heal with each other. Let's love each other. And let's organize together and be a common force for good and getting what we need as a community. And we'll definitely be more effective at that if we're able to trust each other and treat each other well and with kindness. So
So I think that's all for tonight, Yarrow.
That does it for this episode of Trans Theory. Thank you so much, as always, for listening, and you'll hear from us next time.